Preparing the live stream.
Okay, we good?
We are.
Okay. Let's call the June 26th meeting of the Lake Stevens Planning Commission to order. Take the roll, quick. Commissioner Connor Davis. Present. Commissioner Linda Holt.
Here.
Commissioner Davis
Present.
and Commissioner, oh my gosh, I'm spacing.
Morton,
Morton, sorry.
just
Uh,
salts.
And then Commissioner Huxford is not here just yet. And but we're not going to necessarily excuse her until she is unable to arrive. So let's do the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America,
And to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. So let's move on to item 3, guest business. Is there any guest business to bring before the commission? Let's move on to item 4, approval of the minutes for June 5th, 2023. If everybody had a chance to review, and is there any comments on? Comments? We have a move in a second. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Janice has joined us under the name Gary.
Hi, Dennis. That moves us on to action item B, housing action plan.
Okay, thank you, Commission, members of the public. Russ Wright, Community Development Director. I'll be sharing with you the results of our housing action plan tonight. So I will first start by apologizing in advance. It's a very dense document and the slideshow is much longer than I usually like to do, but I do want to go through at least the flavor of the document. There will be some slides that I will go through really quickly. And I want to make sure we leave lots of time at the end for good questions, conversation. And if you can help me online, if there's questions coming up from Ms. Huxford,
Yes.
Would be great. Okay, with that, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so the housing action plan is something we started about 18 months ago with Burke Consultants. What it does is it looks at housing broadly in the city of Lake Stevens. Sorry, my slides are not advancing. Okay, there we go. As I was saying, it broadly looks at housing in Lake Stevens, both code, incentives, overall stock supply, looks at regional issues, affordability, access to housing from different types of groups. So as we go through it, the housing action plan includes 4 main elements. So there's the housing needs assessment, which just takes a look at the demographics of the city and sort of the regional need. Then there's the summary of the public engagement. There was a robust public engagement process throughout, getting the opinions and perspectives of lots of groups. And then there were policy recommendations. And then moving beyond the policy recommendations would be the implementation strategy, looking at which of these items to take on first, in what order, and what would the magnitude of that effect be of that implementation piece. So we'll talk about the needs assessment first. So why are we planning for housing? Well, under Vision 2050, which is the guiding document from the Puget Sound Regional Council, and under the Growth Management Act, cities and counties need to plan for the future. There have been new inclusions in the Growth Management Act that also now have us planning not just for employment and population. We are also now planning for housing targets and specific housing targets as they relate to income brackets and supportive housing. So those are things now that we have to be cognizant of those numbers aside from these more gross numbers that we're used to looking at. So we know there's a lot of regional pressure right now for housing. That's all you hear. That's all that was through the legislature this year is how do we accommodate additional housing? One of the things that you all know is how much Lake Stevens has grown. If we look back to 2011, the population was about 28,000. In 2022, our population was over 40,000. That was both due to a lot of annexations, but it was also due to a lot of significant growth and development inside the city. We've just talked about that there are population and housing targets that we have to look towards. And we're also looking to the update to our comprehensive plan, which we will look at our housing element to try and include a lot of the elements coming out of this housing action plan and new legislation that's come out of the state to be compliant. And then we also know that there's limited buildable land supply in Lake Stevens. So that becomes really important as we look to 2024, that where we have the majority of our availability at this point comes into infill and redevelopable sites with a diminishing quantity of vacant lands to accommodate these goals that we're going to be talking about. And the chart on this page just shows the growth of Lake Stevens going back again with those sort of key measures, 2010-ish to 2022, and then our projection forward. So looking backwards, we've grown at a rate of over 3% per year, which is about double any other jurisdiction in Snohomish County. And moving forward will be more on pace at about 1% if we grow as this graph indicates. Likely we won't. What are some of the other reasons that we should plan for housing? We've just talked about that there's new housing requirements that have come out of the Growth Management Act. Specifically, how do we deal with the missing middle housing or moderate density housing, if you will? How do we promote affordable housing? And this sort of sets the playing field for what do we need to take on, which is about 3,000 affordable units. So those are units that residents less than 80% of the median income, the average median income, can afford and not become price burdened. We need to also accommodate emergency housing. These are shelters and supportive housing. And then we also need to look at the racially disparate impacts that may have happened over the past with the way our zoning code has developed. Okay, so recent city changes. All of you are very familiar that going between 2018 and about 2020, the city took on several initiatives to try to be a little bit more progressive and come up with some solutions to housing prior to the state legislature enacting House Bill 1220 and most recently 1110. So some of the actions that the city has taken would be to look at our accessory dwelling code to create a design review process that's administrative, not another board, to do some zoning amendments, to look at more diverse housing types through our infill code, to create a multifamily housing tax exemption, and to increase our SEPA thresholds. And these all become important as we talk about some of the implementation pieces later on. So we'll just look at some of the demographics for the city. So we've talked about this before. Lake Stevens has a cohort, one of the populations between 30 and 39, a really large segment of our population. A relationship to that then is also the age of children or people under 18 is also a growing demographic in this community. One of the other growing demographics would be the baby boomers. And a big concern is how do they age in place? It's inverse of the other housing question we have is when I'm done with high school or college, can I live in Lake Stevens? So we have to look at all of the age groups as we make these considerations. So if we want to look at the population of Lake Stevens, specifically looking at race and ethnicity, We know that about 15% of the population identifies as a person of color, with the largest group being Hispanics or Latino. And this is lower than the county average, which is about 27% would identify as a person of color. And then the households also of color are inversely a higher proportion of renters at 48% versus the rest of the population, about 42% of other households are renters. Some of the construction trends, as you know, we've been building predominantly single-family homes over the last decade, and that makes up about 81% of our zoning. And we have had more multifamily projects in the last few years, and we've received about 419 new units that are multifamily, and we know that that segment of our development will continue. And so what do we need to do? Well, we need to accommodate an additional 4,300 housing units with over 2,000 of them right now being in the development pipeline. So we still have over 2,000 units that we need to produce to meet some of our targets. And then we talked about this earlier, that we have limited vacant land supply. So only about 8% of our land supply now would be categorized as vacant. And so the rest of that will have to come from infill as we look to satisfy these goals and as we move into our comp plan. So if we want to look specifically at incomes in Lake Stevens, our income is very close to the county average. The household median income would be about 93,000, with the county being about 89,000. But what's more interesting is in Lake Stevens, the distribution is much narrower for the overall. There's not as wide of swing between the least affluent and the most affluent. And then we can look at ownership as another indicator of affordability. About 3/4 of the households in Lake Stevens, or about 61%, own their own homes. And this has the ratio of home prices, though, has also continued to increase, which is what this graph shows. So generally, we still have home ownership, but the houses have gotten relatively more expensive as the years have gone by. Rental affordability. 60% of the renters in the city would be considered to have lower household incomes. That is below 80% of the average median income. So if I use AMI, that's what that means, average median income. So that is the income of most folks throughout Snohomish County. And then sometimes usually we're going to be referring to household incomes rather than individual incomes. And so we do know there are gaps for renters at both the low and high ends of the spectrum. And we have a lower proportion, though, in Lake Stevens of extremely low income renters. Again, that's because we have that relatively stable average income in the community. Okay, so now we'll turn to the public engagement process. So as we went through the public engagement process, there were several broad goals to encourage a broad range of stakeholders. And that was accomplished by having meetings with developers, service organizations, community workshops, meetings with the Planning Commission, meetings with the City Council, open house, meetings with our Citizens Advisory Committee, Youth Advisory Committee, and Community Transit. So really trying to get a well-rounded group in different types of venues, as well as a community-wide survey and then interaction at, say, Aquafest, like we traditionally do. We also wanted to identify our unmet housing needs, build sort of a collective understanding of the needs of the community and sort of display those both in a narrative and a graphic form, and then increase awareness of the city's recent efforts that we just talked about to increase its housing capacity. So on the right-hand column, it just goes into some of the outreach activities that I've already mentioned. So I'm going to go through these really quickly, probably hard to read on these screens, but I just put in a few selected survey results. So does your current housing meet the needs of your household? Which is interesting that about 62% of the people that took the survey said that their housing did meet their needs, with 25% saying it only somewhat met my needs and then really falling off. So that's actually a pretty positive sign, and it's in line with the home ownership and the income that we've talked about. What neighborhood characteristics across all mediums and with all groups, safety of neighborhoods was one of the number one concerns. And then you'd see affordability. And what's interesting is what came in third, the quality or proximity to schools. Historically, that has been the number one quality of life metric that we've seen. So it's interesting to see that that's fallen a couple of spaces. And then what challenges are people in Lake Stevens facing? So even though people are generally doing okay, it looks like by the information, they're still concerned about the housing prices. And again, that would be probably looking at specific age groups and other demographic makeups that we've sort of talked about. And then one of the questions was, what 3 words describe your hopes for Lake Stevens? Community, friendly, safe, affordable schools. So a lot of these things support that previous survey question that we just looked at. And then just one more survey question out there. What housing goals do you think Lake Stevens should prioritize? And again, improve safety becomes is asked again and answered again in a very similar way. And then one thing that's interesting though is looking for cohesive growth becomes sort of distinguished, which is something we've talked about a lot on all of the growth that we talk about with this board. Okay, so then we went to the community workshops. Again, we went to our community advisory council, which is a council that directs some communications to the mayor. And then we had a open house. So some of the major topics are, how are the housing needs changing in the community? What type of housing options does Lake Stevens need to improve upon or provide more of? Where should new housing go? And then if you look at the open house, and this was the community open house, and some of the members of this board and the community attended and did some interactive activities. So where should higher density development go? And you'll see this show up again throughout the presentation. Maybe we look back to our existing sub areas and our existing plan centers as sort of the obvious choice. Generally, the open house group thought that missing middle housing options integrated throughout all neighborhoods was appropriate, like we've already started to do. There wasn't a lot of consensus on infill and ADU locations, but what was discussed is it should be citywide, but there's also a focus to look at larger lots where they can more easily accommodate that without secondary impacts to neighborhoods. Transit has been identified as a major limiting factor, and this is to increase density. And we all know that with just the smaller transit station and limited regular bus lines. And then one suggestion did talk about industrial areas for residential uses. That would have to be also considered with what are the impacts. And we know that in our industrial area, the residential components that followed the previously existing industrial have created a lot of conflict over the years due to the very different types of land uses. So then we went out to our local industry stakeholders. Again, those might be housing groups, local builders, developers, and our Chamber of Commerce. And they had a similar conversation, and they talked about, what is the support for that? Just support for affordable housing is not sufficient enough. What else do we need to do? Where can we look at the housing? Again, should we shift it to arterials and centers, to appropriate key locations in the city? Home ownership options are important. So again, continuing to support what this community has had. accommodating local workers. I know we've talked a lot about that, but not tonight. So we've talked about sort of age distribution, but it's also important that the people are, whether they are our service jobs, retail, or just for general employment, that you can live and work in your community. And that also satisfies lots of other goals that the community is trying to create. Where do we fit in with the regional strategy? One idea is looking at surplus lands. If the city has surplus lands, making those available if they're zoned appropriately for affordable housing. Keep looking at the data we have, our buildable lands reporting, and make sure that we're really monitoring what we have left and what our targets are, something we already do, but you'll see that emphasized again throughout this presentation. Just general comment on development, that development conditions are difficult. And in this case, they're specifically talking about, again, the land supply and the remaining lands that we have. So sites are challenging. And there was recognition that the city does a good job processing, but they believe that there still could be some additional streamlining, specifically coordination with special purpose districts and other outside agencies that are part of the review process. And then talking to community transit, really talking about they have their constraints as well, where they can expand to. A lot of this still stems from how much they declined during the COVID-19 pandemic. Exploration of different service models. We're working with community transit right now to do that, to see are there other transit models that will fit in Lake Stevens. So working through that pilot program. And then, revisiting service routes that do have potential, to increase demand. And again, that's going to be for routes that take people to job centers and, other parts of the county would be that emphasis. So here are some of the findings from the engagement. People understood that affordable housing is a problem in the city and in the region, and they recognize that overall more homes do need to be built. We've already talked about this. There are always concerns about what does growth look like? How does it impact me? What's the appropriate location? Still a focus on owner occupied housing, but also understanding we have to look at other tools now because there are new mandates. So we have to shift our paradigm on housing a bit. We've talked about this, and this also was one of the findings. We need to look at transportation as we look at our housing goals. And it's not just public transit, it's our road system, it's our multimodal transportation system. So inclusive, how are we providing transportation between neighborhoods to commercial areas and to public amenities? And then again, as we go back to the second bullet, when we talk about what does growth look like, this is the other part of that the focus should be on. It's okay that we have targets and we work towards those, but also there's an expectation that we have high quality neighborhoods. And you'll all recall that when we went through the Citizens Advisory Group working to the infill standards, that was one of the key issues that they really thought was important. They weren't as concerned about the density, but they were concerned about how does my neighborhood feel? Do I have some sense of privacy? Do I have some sense of open space in my own neighborhood? So those thoughts haven't changed over the last few years. So now we'll move into some of the policy recommendations. So we need to come up with just general strategies to meet our housing targets. So one of those, again, is making sure we have sufficient amount of developable lands. And so that is tracking our buildable lands and really looking at the opportunities for those infill and redevelopable portions of the community, making sure that the appropriate transportation is there, making sure that the appropriate utilities are there and other public amenities. We're going to need to consider some regulatory changes and also look at some fee schedules to make development of affordable housing. So this is at the lower end of the bracket, easier and reduce barriers. And then how do we implement incentive programs, again, that promote the development of affordable housing? That's activities that the city can take on itself. It's also activities that we're going to have to rely on partner agencies to help us move through. And then we need to coordinate the funding for affordable housing. Again, really trying to target those at the lower bracket of the income level. And then there are some strategic recommendations again. And some of these are going to be seem a little bit redundant, but they all have a slightly different flavor and the outcome is just slightly different. So we do need to address our housing capacity. And one of the ways to do that is to look at zoning strategically. You know, as we move through our comprehensive plan, we need to set some metrics, some specific criteria to really help us focus on what areas are appropriate for additional zoning. How do we go about, again, creatively meeting the state requirements? And as we go through our comprehensive plan update, we will definitely update all of our policies to be consistent with new state regulations. And then it becomes the implementation piece after that, the follow through, that we make sure that our codes then align with whatever new policies that we adopt. And then the last one's really open-ended. We just need to consider additional strategies maybe that we haven't thought about, but be very creative as we work to achieve these housing goals that we're going to set for ourselves as a community. So the housing capacity, we already talked about. Look at sub-area plans that came out of this in a couple of areas. So we can potentially expand the boundaries. We can allow more density. We know in the 20th Street sub-area, we've pretty much built out the residential capacity. So it's the perfect time to reevaluate what is the housing capacity. In the downtown plan, even though it's the most recent plan, we've already recognized that the boundaries probably should have been a little bit larger than they were, because the areas that have similar zoning but not the same zoning have been a little bit more difficult to coordinate or have people understand what they can or can't do. So that would sort of simplify the process and give some benefits that the sub-area plan has. We've just talked about the strategic upzoning. Again, it's looking at the key locations outside of sub-areas, what makes sense as we make those decisions. We need to continue to encourage different types of housing as we look at House Bill 1110. That was the latest missing middle housing legislation. This called for up to sixplexes in residential neighborhoods. And overall, a community has to adopt 6 of the 9 strategies that they recommend. In the case of Lake Stevens, they also allow for an exemption, and we will ask for the exemption based on the prior work that's been completed. And then we need to revisit our ADU regulations again. Specifically, we need to look at the minimum size. And now the state legislation requires that 2 ADUs are allowed per unit. So again, through a mapping exercise, we really need to be cognizant and map out where it's even practical to have an attached and a detached unit on every lot. And again, looking at the lot size and parking and those other considerations. Just mention this, we need to ensure that our previous efforts are considered under the new state requirements. And then the ongoing monitoring of our housing targets and our land supply over the next 10 to 20 years is going to be more crucial than any probably time in our planning past. Additional state requirements. So beyond just the regular targets, we have to look at emergency housing locations. We have to look at permanent supportive housing, and for supportive housing for people with disabilities, and making sure that our regulations, our policies, and then our actual development regulations are not creating barriers to the housing that we need to try and accommodate in the community. Some of the things we can do to try to, again, look at those barriers. We can look at our impact fees. The state legislation now says that impact fees for ADUs, so those would be parks, schools, and traffic impact fees that the city collects to make sure that a property is concurrent, that it's paying for its share of impact, can't exceed 50% of what your standard single family fee would be. We actually already do that because we charge them the fee that you would charge a one-bedroom apartment. So it's maybe not half, but we've already identified that charging a full impact fee is a barrier. So we just need to make sure that the fee we're charging is in line with that. And then no impact fees for emergency housing. That's not part of our current fee program, but that's something that we do need to adopt. And then we need to look at anti-displacement policy. So this is sort of the paradox when you talk about housing and affordable housing. We've established that there's a need to increase overall housing supply. There's also a need to make sure that your existing housing supply is not displaced and torn down to allow for new large complexes. Again, because some of the older traditional housing is meeting the need for some of our lower income residents. So like I say, that's the biggest paradox in this whole conversation, trying to balance those couple of issues. Okay, so now we're going to look at some additional strategies. Some of the easy recommendations would be, can we refine our multifamily housing property tax exemption? If you'll recall, we have an 8-year and a 12-year program. The 8-year is a market rate program that you would get a ad valorem tax reduction to your property tax. So you don't pay your property tax for the 8 years to spur the growth of that industry. And if you want the 12-year, you have to do an affordable component. Some of the new regulations would allow this program to be pushed out for 20 years, increase the overall area in the city, the geographic area. So lots of changes to that program that we can look into to see if it makes sense. I will say to date, no one has taken advantage of this program, but we have it in place and we can continue to look for modifications and revisions.
Yeah, Russ, what qualifies affordable housing? Is there a price per square foot? What does the city consider to be affordable housing?
Okay, so again, I'll go back to that AMI definition that I believe the code that we have adopted, and please correct me if I'm incorrect, I believe we set it at below 80% AMI would qualify. So if the standard rent across the county would meet that general threshold, then that would be affordable. I can't give you an exact number right now, but it's going to be looking at the county average for cost of rent for a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, a 3-bedroom, based on the income level.
Local income. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
And the big metric is it's not affordable if you're spending more than 30% of your salary for housing and your utilities. Some of the other ideas, there's a community land trust, which would be sort of like a condo co-op, that the co-op would own the land and then the condo units would be owned by individual property owners. So that's also another way that might allow more affordable housing. It's not something that we wouldn't allow today, but it's not something we've described in those kind of discrete terms. So just again, looking at flexibility for ownership types, development type, housing types across a whole gamut. We can continue to look how to streamline our permit process. We could offer expedited permitting, again, attached to affordable housing projects. So when Jill opens up her dashboard, if she has an affordable project, it would jump to the top of the queue rather than be, set out, 4 or 6 weeks for that first look. And then really, again, it's about education. So what's the information that the city can provide to our housing community, to our development community, working with housing groups? We already are a member of the Alliance for Affordable Housing, and we have monthly meetings with them, and we work closely with them. We work closely with Snohomish County through Snohomish County Tomorrow as we look at the housing goals and set those goals for the county then that trickle back to us at the city level. So we are active participants through that whole process. And we'll continue to do that. And that also reflects the partnerships that we just need to continue the partnerships we have, but expand our partnerships to look for other affordable housing providers or other housing providers in general, again, across all spectrums, economic spectrum. Okay, so now on to the implementation strategy. We're getting through this. The implementation strategy, they were broken up in a couple of ways. One, what are the short-term, midterm, and long-term actions we can take? And again, the timing really relates to sort of three broad things. So the short-term actions are really going to be actions we need to take and tie those into our comprehensive plan. The midterm actions are going to be those implementation pieces. So we've updated our goals and policies throughout our comp plan. Now we do the heavy lifting and update our zoning code to make sure that it reflects these things. And then long-term are those actions that are going to be out after 5 years. So that's really going to be monitoring. You know, again, are we monitoring our buildable supply? Are we monitoring the effectiveness of codes? As I mentioned, the multifamily tax exemption, that was sort of a monitoring phase. We've done it, hasn't been used. So we do track those things to just understand what the policy we do, how effective it's been. And then they're also ranked by priority. So is it a very high priority that it'll have the most bang for the buck, down to a high priority or a moderate priority? So then we'll combine the priority versus the shorter, mid, or long term to really focus on what should that action look like, because the three sort of fundamental categories we'll look at in a minute are both defined both in terms of timing and priority rank. And so our consultant put those all into a matrix. I'm going to show you what the matrix looks like, but I'm not going to spend any time on that. So again, addressing needs for local capacity and shortfall. You'll see the implementation steps, the action, who the partner is, what's the priority, and the investment in the short term. Meeting additional state requirements. Again, there's a definition for the short term, and then additional strategies to achieve the housing goals. Then you'll see this, all these same questions again up here for midterm and then long-term for successes. So that was 180 pages in about 20 minutes. So everybody good? Any slides I can go back to? Commissioner Davis?
It's okay. I had two super quick questions. One is has to do with this issue, the eternal issue of affordable housing. I'm curious about whether ultimately it'll be broken out in terms of incentivizing by age. I'm thinking of the need for senior and supported affordability. So that's a question about how age will factor into that. And then the second question I had was about the anti-displacement policies. And I'm wondering if they're just super high level, if you can comment on potential funding sources for those strategies, whether that's something that the city would generate or whether there's outside grant funding or federal, state. So sorry, those are disparate questions.
No, both good questions. So I think as we talk about policy in the comp plan, we'll be doing both. We'll be looking at what is the impact on, we'll say, senior populations, and can we create incentives for that type of group? But we're also going to be looking across all demographic groups, ethnic, racial groups, to make sure there are no disparities, people with disabilities and people of different age groups. So we'll really try to focus on all of those distinct categories of people to make sure there aren't barriers, or look at ways that we can reduce barriers, which in the case of senior housing is probably a little bit easier, that there are a lot of senior groups out there, and they have been, sort of courting the city of Lake Stevens because we know that there's a need and they know there's a need, but we can look at those policies. As far as your next question, the reduction of barriers, I've been giving that one a lot of thought. As a government agency, we're not the best poised to make sure that, say, manufactured community continues into perpetuity because we don't control the market. So I think that piece really, our role becomes that coordination piece and helping to put people in touch with other funding groups. So I think that really becomes a regional or a state or a federal level issue to really look at these really big financial questions to sort of tackle that second issue.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I had a question, I guess, regarding the implementation strategy. And,
Mhm.
you know, the theory is, you know, you can provide all these
Yeah.
incentives and all of these reductions in barriers and hurdles that organizations would need to clear. But ultimately, it sounds like maybe there's some hesitancy on the part of some of the developers to come in and actually you know, embrace these and build these kind of structures
Mhm.
for individuals. Is there anything in here or anything in the new state law that says, you know, and if this doesn't happen, then what happens to the city? I mean, we can only go so far as a municipal organization.
Great question. So the city's role is just that. We need to put the policy in place and the codes in place that provide for the opportunity. We can go beyond that and provide these economic incentives, these education pieces, but ultimately the city could build some affordable housing itself, but it's not poised to do that well. So no, our job is to set the policies in place, reduce those barriers and make sure that there is access to these. Again, we can offer incentives, some limited financial incentives that you guys just sort of saw. We can also require inclusionary zoning. So as we talk about some of our code updates, so what inclusionary zoning is, it becomes a mandated portion of a development. And one of the suggestions from our consultant is we look at our planned residential development code that right now allows for a mix of housing types in a single neighborhood. And it does have some percentages based on, or of single family to multifamily. And it gives a density bonus. And our consultant is suggesting that density bonus, we should make it mandatory to, you have to do an affordable piece. We have a little bit, we have no mandatory inclusionary, we have some voluntary inclusionary zoning where, say in our sub-area plans, we've said we'll give you an extra floor if you do X, Y, and Z for, you know, sort of a community amenity or how you handle your parking. So we've done that in a light way, but there's a lot of hesitancy amongst most jurisdictions to say every development you will produce X. And that becomes, yeah, this hard part and sort of the hesitancy of how far the developer take it. Yeah. Can I go beyond what you asked?
No, that's actually really good information and sounds like there's in our good faith effort, there is safe harbor.
Yes.
In this.
Yes.
That's what I was getting at.
Yep. Commissioner Morton, I think you were gonna.
Yes,
question.
so. Glad that we're focused on making sure that there's a lot of affordable housing. It seems that one of the biggest ways to have affordable housing is by having more supply. And the best way to, or the easiest way to have more supply is more land. And I know I've mentioned this before, but what is the process or what are the requirements to extend the urban growth boundary to the east? Even if we were to extend it to Machias, it's not even that Machias, I think. But yeah. What are those requirements? And I would think that would be part of their strategy too.
One would think so. So the city has some active applications with Snohomish County right now for urban growth area expansion. The county will only look at those every 5 years. And with their 2024 docket is the only time they've actually moved on those and have brought them a little further into their action alternatives for their comprehensive plan update. So it's a pretty high hurdle to get an urban growth area boundary changed. But it is definitely the supply and demand is definitely a part of that. And that's where other conflicting goals and mandates under the Growth Management Act is to contain and to continue what you have rather than.
It's fighting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, mandate growth. So, however difficult those boundaries are, or those areas are. I hope that actually part of our strategy here, because I saw on here that there's a number of strategies about policy recommendations. I think that should be added as an additional policy recommendation, which is to requirements to extend the urban growth boundary so that we can achieve more housing affordability. I would think that would also, I don't know what those requirements are, but I would think that if we exceed our growth targets, which it looks like we are on path to do, especially if we increase, do the things that we're talking about here, that we will exceed those targets. And we will be much more populous than we expected.
Well, under the last
So-
growth monitoring report, yes, we were over our target. The target has shifted again, though, so we were looking at about an 800 population surplus. Now we're at about a 700 population deficit with the latest kind of growth projection. So there's always kind of a moving.
Also in the, on the policy recommendations page, which is page 9 of the packet, on 1.2, actually specifically 1.2.3 says update zoning regularly to maintain necessary capacity. And what that says to me is that we're constantly tweaking the zoning now. R4, oh, R6, no, wait, actually, that's too much, that's too little. Well, if instead of tweaking it so frequently, can we broaden the zoning so that we give developers and landowners more options rather than having to constantly be, asking for things to be tweaked or having to be driving, looking through the rear mirror. So I'd like to see more broader zoning rather than constantly changing the zoning that we have.
And that was really the goal of the 2018 effort. That's exactly what we did do, was broaden the zoning. We went through the permissible use table to clean that up to make sure that it was actually effective and we were providing, sort of diversity and flexibility. We'll definitely, as we go into the 2024 update, do that same exercise again. How do we have really effective zoning and what does that look like?
It's a clarifying question. I thought your point was really well put about the urban growth area expansion. So I just want to get some clarity for myself. Is it that, so I know the county has their own goals that they have to meet and they're going through the same process that we are. So, but they're also the deciding body for whether or not they're going to cede some of their available land supply to us. So, oh.
Yes.
Got it.
Mike, Janice has a question.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Thank you. I appreciate you accommodating me. I have one comment and then several questions, although one of my questions was just answered by Director Wright. Thank you. I have, just for reference, for those of you that are in the room and on the call, a rental that over the past 2 years has increased $3,000 in property taxes alone. So when we're talking about affordable housing and keeping tenants in their homes, it's the pain is real and we all know it, but it's not something that as a landlord we can absorb. So a couple of those graphics just made me want to make sure that that is spoken out loud. I did my notes based on the pages of our packet. So if you'll bear with me, I have it by page. And in page number 52, There was a comment mid-page about the project being right-sized. And it was in parentheses, it's right-sized idea. And that concerns me only because of issues that we've discussed before, in that you're butting up something that is now zoned for something next to a housing development that was built as something. And what is right-sized? How is that going to flow with any kind of continuity? And I just thought that that was an interesting way of wording that, and perhaps there was another way of making that better defined. And then Director Wright was kind enough to let me know that they're asking for an exemption on page number 58. 6 of 9 types. And my question was, what are we leaning towards? The 6 that we already have seem to accommodate everything that we could possibly, in my opinion, want, for lack of a better way of saying that, in the city. So I appreciate the exemption being worked. To not well, I'll just say it. On page 59, we talk about waterfront, and we've been around and around about waterfront and a lot of different discussions. And we actually have council members, one of which is our liaison, that has said that the waterfront shouldn't be any different than any other community in our neighborhood. And I respectfully disagree. We pay different taxes as waterfront residents, and that is a neighborhood just like any other neighborhood. So the idea that waterfront is being held to the same standards perhaps as some of the other areas in our city when we are lucky enough to have waterfront, I would strongly and will continue to argue against. So whatever we can do to maintain that neighborhood and the value of our lake in the middle of it. And then again, page 59, very close to it, this idea that we're exceeding. And I like that we've gotten in front of some of the stuff that's coming out of Olympia, but never would I want to be the city that exceeds what Olympia is pouring on us. And the word we exceed concerns me because there's more coming, and lot splitting and all these other things that are on the table for our next legislative session bother me greatly. 1110, in my opinion, was bad legislation. And we are having to bear the brunt of that as a city that was in front of this, but to try to exceed that is something that I would just urge our decision makers to avoid. And I think that that's the end of my tirade.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you. Was there other comments from the commission? Director Wright, I see on here that there's a recommendation requested that we forward a recommendation to the city council to approve the Lake Stevens Housing Action Plan. Is that
That is correct.
a vote that is, I guess, requested of us?
Yes.
Is there any thoughts or is there a motion on the subject?
One more question. So around, I know that Lake Stevens, there's been an evolution in what Lake Stevens considers to be high density. There's high density zoned areas south of 20th Street Southeast that are single family homes. But when houses were built 10 years ago, Lake Stevens considered houses that are built this close to each other to be high density. For it to be like consideration to be put into future development in, say, downtown, when we consider it to be high density, that we need to be building up. Maybe not what was considered, 5 stories at the corner, just around the corner from here, but for that to really come into consideration, which I'm presuming already is in the works.
Yeah, all of that already is in existence. So you're right, there has been an evolution in at least what the community interprets as in high density. So yeah, the single family in the R812, that's a medium density kind of single family configuration. We've used 15 dwelling units per acre as sort of that bright line of what goes from medium density to a higher density. And as you describe, say, the downtown sub area or some of the other sub areas that allow apartments or mixed use development, it really becomes, if you can park it, you can build it, to dumb it down pretty far. So there, and if you stick within the constraints of height regulations, floor to area ratio, whatever those bulk matrix requirements are, you can build it. So there's not a defined upper
Yes.
limit.
It's not so much what's allowed, but requiring certain levels of density in downtown.
Yep, which we have done.
Okay. Thank you.
Were there any other questions or comments before? Okay, was there a motion?
Mike, before you, this is Janice again, by the way, if, before we go to a vote, are the notes, are our comments tonight going to be attached to this packet when it is forwarded to council?
They will have your verbal comments, yes.
Well, I'll make a motion that we forward the housing action plan onto city council for adoption.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Thank you.
I will not oppose, although I'm doing this with some angst. So I appreciate you bearing with me, but yes, I agree that this should be forwarded.
Commissioner Huxford, just for clarification, that's a yes vote.
That is a yes vote. Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you. That brings us to item 5, discussion items. A, the 2023 comprehensive plan update.
All right, well, good evening, Planning Commission, Christy Schmidt, Senior Planner here this evening. Present along with Jill Needham and myself, we are going to co-present this evening. And I'm going to open up my screen here and share, so bear with me just a minute, while I shrink everyone. I would like to point out that we do have 2 applicants here this evening for the citizen initiative proposal. So they are here in the audience this evening also. That would be for the Chapman Amendment. Okay.
Christy, while that's loading, can you make sure that the microphone is in front of you?
Yes. We'll
Thank
slide
you.
it there. Is that better?
Way better. Thank you.
There we go. Okay, and for some reason, it's not showing. Let's see, let's go right here. Try it again. There we go. Second time's a charm. Okay, so within your packet this evening, you had a staff report along with review criteria, some maps, and an analysis of each of the 4 proposals. So as far as the background goes, this is, I believe, the 3rd time the 2023 docket has been before you. Started back in February when you had your first introduction. Then after your introduction, it went to City Council in February, came back to you to set the docket back in March. Then your recommendation was forwarded to the City Council for ratification of the docket. So this evening, our charge has been to prepare an analysis for each of the 4 proposals before you. And it's a high-level analysis. And after you hear this analysis this evening, the next steps before you are your recommendations on the proposal. It's moved forward to City Council very quickly on July 11. Then we notice our Department of Commerce to let them notify that we're looking at amending the city's comprehensive plan. Then you'll be holding a public hearing on the docket. Then your recommendation gets moved forward to the City Council, and those public hearings would occur in the fall of 2023. And we're estimating probably September for you. So taking a look at the proposals, the first one is the map amendments to the land use element. We did vet out any changes to the capital facilities and park amendments. At this time, we've decided to postpone those and wait for the big update in 2024. So tonight you'll just have an overview of the changes to the land use element, which Jill will be presenting. And along with M1, it's a city initiated map amendment for the Cedarwood Park facility out there. Jill will also be presenting that along with M2, which is another city initiated map amendment to do a correction or reverse of a zone change. And then M3, which is the one citizen initiated map amendment tonight. I'll be presenting that one at the end and concluding. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jill to do her presentation.
Great, thank you, Christy. So for T1, this text amendment was used to update the chapter. Basically just reflect some changes that we've had in population increases, annexations, the reasonable measures, buildable lands data, making that consistent language for the Lake Industrial Center. And then all instances homes were replaced with short-term rentals after the passing of the short-term rental. So along with the text amendment, map amendments were proposed, 2 of which were initiated and then 1 of which the decision.
Jenny, can we check Jill's mic? Please?
Is this better, Janice?
Yeah, you're cutting in and out, but I was just wondering if it maybe got moved weird, but yes, that's much better. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, we'll do a swap over here. So all the amendments in T1 were just purely administrative. We found that they were consistent with the decision criteria that's found in your packet. And next slide. So for the map amendments this year, we have 3 total. 2 city initiated and then 1 is citizen initiated. So when considering these amendments, we analyzed the projected housing, the projected employment, both of which the city has not currently met the growth target for. The next slide. So the first city amendment, you've seen this one before. This is for the Cedarwood property. It's an existing 1-story, 5,000 square foot common use building. It's kind of located in the middle of like a multifamily zone. The city recently purchased it with the intention of creating a future park and community center. And it is proposed to be rezoned from R8-12 to public/semi-public to really reflect that community use. And there it is on the map. And then next slide, please. So the full decision criteria are again in your packet, but we're just going to go over the Cliff Notes version in the interest of time. So rezoning it to public/semi-public creates more consistency with how other city properties are zoned. And it was also identified as a park in the city park chapter of the comprehensive plan. And then development of the site is fairly limited by a stream and an existing wetland. So the buildable lands report did classify it as a constant/replacement use. And then it does have a projected job capacity of about 12 employees and 12 PM peak round trips for traffic generation, and PM peak trips is how we calculate that projected traffic increase. So M2, that's another city initiated amendment. This amendment is proposed to rezone a residential zoned property on South Lake Stevens Road from R6, I believe, to CD, which is commercial district. So this property was originally rezoned from residential to commercial back in 2019, but was all of 97th was rezoned back to residential last year. The current owner of the half-acre property had purchased it based on that prior commercial zoning with the intent to operate a commercial daycare. Next slide, please. So the full criteria, again, it's in your packet. Oh, can you go on? Yeah, so it's right next to 97th, and that's South Lake Stevens Road there, running east to west. Yep, thank you. So again, that full criteria is in your packet. The site has a developable area of just over half an acre, and the buildable lands report identified it as having no additional residential capacity. Snohomish County did designate Lake Stevens as kind of a daycare desert where the demand really outweighs the supply. And so additional jobs are projected to be added, and a PM peak trip increase ranging from 2 to 12 trips is also projected.
Okay, well, that brings us to M, the ones that. The zoning for it is, well, 5.4 acres. Check. Can you hear me? Okay, we're presuming I'm good. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. So the request from the applicant is to go from mixed use to residential use. This particular application, it was originally rezoned from residential to commercial back in 2008. So the applicant who is here this evening, they have marketed the property for the past 13 years. We, based on buildable lands analysis and in looking at the particular property that's located north of Lundin Parkway, across from the public park there. If you take a look at it, what our analysis revealed in your packet is you can see the extensive critical areas over here to the west. And then in addition, it carries through and the wetlands flow through the site. They take up a majority of the portion of the site. So as far as development feasibility to get a good large commercial footpad on there, they haven't been able to achieve that. So it hasn't been viably marketable for a mixed use development. So the applicant has requested a rezone back to residential use. And it seems to be very suitable for the area. We have multifamily over here on the west. We have single family over here to the east. So the zoning that they're requesting to R8, R12 would provide a nice transition zoning for the comprehensive plan, and it would be consistent with that. And so let's take a look at the decision criteria summary. As Jill noted, we're looking at it really for key 4 things. We have found that it hasn't been viable for mixed use development. It is consistent with the surrounding residential uses, so residential uses would be a good fit for there. And as far as the 2021 buildable lands analysis go, it has very limitable or limited developable area due to the critical areas. It's less than an acre, which is one reason why it's been hard to market for mixed use development. It is constrained by wetlands. It does have an existing job capacity of 9.8 employees based on the existing mixed use designation. And the residential capacity is 2.5 units for that. I would like to point out that when we did the buildable lands analysis, we did notice that the residential capacity caps it at 1 story. It doesn't account for the vertical. So that is why if you see this low number here, that is why. It's 2.5 because it counts for 1 level. The proposed residential capacity is 8 detached units under the R8, R12 zone. And that would be the lower end. And then obviously for the attached, it goes up to 12 dwelling units. It results in a maximum increase in PM peak trips of approximately 7. Basically, the analysis concludes that it's consistent with the review criteria and it would help fulfill the housing needs requirement and shortage that Russ described earlier in the housing needs report. With that, it brings us to the conclusion of our exciting matrix up here. This is a new matrix this year. It's a cumulative matrix. So it has all 3 of the map amendments on here. We have it from existing land use to proposed. So you can see it for each 3. We have the total site acreage. And then as you can see, the buildable acreage. And this really helps justify each proposal as to why it meets or doesn't meet the criteria. And as summarized by staff, we have found that all 3 of them do meet the 11 points of criteria that are contained within your packet. And it also has cumulative PM peak hour trips. City staff has found that the cumulative impacts for jobs and housing targets have been met. There's none of them, or it's very minimal, and no cumulative impacts for transportation based on the PM peak generation. And same with the impacts to adjacent land uses. We find that the proposed land uses would be consistent and compatible with adjacent uses. And the sites are suitable for the proposed zoning and development in conclusion. And with that, we'd like to open that for questions from the Planning Commission on each of the proposals.
M1, I just
M1.
wanted to say is so exciting. It's such an investment in our community and our quality of life. I'm really happy to see the city moving forward on something like that. And then as far as I feel like one of our constant balancing test discussions as a planning commission is balancing the needs of the community and private property rights. And I feel like the analysis that went into this and your a really thorough, nuanced look at that. Balancing the community's needs for ability with an individual property owners. It's their property as they would like to, so.
Thank you for your comments. Anything else from the commission?
Does what are the city's plans for that community center on M1? Any?
Yeah, I can address that in a general sense. So the city has received some state funding to put investments into that to start a remodel. We've started an outreach program to look for some partners to help us manage that facility, but that's as far as we've got concrete plans at this point.
What are other comments? Any comments from the web? Thanks for giving us a thumbs up.
Dennis?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was shaking my head no. I think we're good. I appreciate the recap. Thank you.
Thank you.
Time you see this will be in a public hearing. We really didn't hear any significant comments, so we'll bring that back to you for hearing.
That sounds great. Us to item 6, Commissioner report. Why don't we start online with Janice? Commissioner report.
Nothing to report at this time. Thank you.
Start down the end with Commissioner Davis.
Yeah, so I think the last time we had a meeting. But the North Lake track and field team, the boys and girls both won their district championship. There were 11 total school records that go back 20-25 years that were broken. Just a really incredible group of student athletes this year. Really proud of all of them. On another note, there's recently there was the opportunity for the council and mayor to read a proclamation declaring June Pride Month. Taking a look at the verbiage from 2021 and 2022, there's not a lot that differs. There's what is objective reality around the the need for young people to feel welcomed by their community. That's objective reality. I am just pretty just disappointed that as a city, our leadership wasn't able to just simply make a declarative statement about respect and love for all residents of Lake Stevens. Yes, I'm a teacher at North Lake Middle School, but my first line of work was in politics in Florida. Florida is a very diverse political state. And one of the proudest things I ever did was in, 2008, 2009, I worked in lobbying to ensure that women like my sister had the opportunity to adopt a child. As a gay woman, she was not allowed to. And in 2010, the appeals, appellate process in the state of Florida, they overturned a decision made in 1977. My sister is going to be an incredible mother. And, here I am, I'm across the country, miss my sister, but, I look at a city and what a city has the opportunity to do. And it's really disappointing that we're kind of alienating a large percentage of, our local citizens here. And hopefully as, we lay out in the discussions today, the city is growing. And that's a great thing. And I hope that as we grow in population, we also grow in our acceptance of people from all walks of life, regardless of their race, color, creed, ethnicity, sex, gender, whatever it is. We love y'all. That's what Lake Stevens is all about.
Well, I wasn't gonna say anything, but I recall from my cousin in Norway and that my mom and I. So, the funeral's gonna be Saturday. Unfortunately, there's no way. So, probably shouldn't have brought that up, but.
I'm sorry. I also would like to address what has been going on and being discussed kind of publicly. And I'm actually going to go tomorrow night to City Council and read this into the record during public comment, but I'd like to read it. It's a very short statement that I wrote about this topic because I've been talking to many people in the community about it. I've served as a Lake Stevens Planning Commissioner for nearly 12 years, and in that capacity, I've come to personally know several of our city council members, including the two that are here tonight, to be committed public servants, and I'm well aware of the time and energy that they expend to promote the public good, which is considerable. It's with that in mind that I would like to express my deep dismay regarding City Council's recent decision not to approve the Lake Stevens Annual Pride Proclamation. I was extremely disappointed to learn that council refused to approve the proclamation, setting our community apart from our neighboring jurisdictions in a very negative way. But I was also disappointed to learn that 5 council members voted to block a council discussion of the matter. This was an insult not only to members of the LGBTQ community and their allies, but also to Lake Stevens as a whole. Stifling a discussion of a matter of public interest like this does not comport with our shared values of community, open dialogue, and public engagement. We cannot be one community around the lake unless every member of our community is able to participate in the process of governance, which is impossible without a clear understanding of how and why our electeds make decisions on our behalf. Actively chilling public discourse regarding matters of public interest when it's been proposed in the appropriate venue and at the appropriate time is out of alignment with effective and inclusive governance. In the spirit of full disclosure, I'm the proud parent of a young man who's a member of the LGBTQ community. He grew up here in Lake Stevens. He took the excellent education and sense of community that this town instilled in him to a position as a 17-year-old Snohomish County Human Rights Commissioner. He went on to Harvard University and then to a public service career at our nation's capital, where he is today. The council's decision to not only reverse its prior support and acknowledgement of our LGBTQ citizens, as well as its refusal to even discuss the issue, is deeply painful for families like mine and many others around the lake who support inclusion of all of our citizens. Finally, public reporting suggests that part of council's decision not to ratify the Pride Proclamation arose from personal beliefs. Therefore, I think it's appropriate to conclude by mentioning some of my personal beliefs that are informing my viewpoint on this matter. I speak up this evening as a longstanding community volunteer who believes in giving my fellow citizens a voice. I speak up as an attorney who believes that public discourse and transparency are the lifeblood of our democratic processes. I speak up as a parent who raised 3 children in this wonderful community and who cares deeply about the children who are being raised here right now. I speak up as a person of faith who believes in standing for the vulnerable. I really, really do believe that these are values that the majority of people in Lake Stevens hold, and I feel that this incident has genuinely failed to reflect that. So I just wanted to share that statement, and I'll be reading that tomorrow as well.
Thank you. That's a wonderful statement. fully endorse it. And Connor, thanks for what you said. Nothing else for me.
And on my part, how can I follow up on what you two said? That is incredible, and I cannot hold a candle to that statement, only throw my full weight behind it and agree and endorse it fully. Thank you for that. And with that, that concludes my comment. Which takes us to item 7, planning director's report.
Okay, just a couple of quick items tonight. So first of all, the city council passed the climate action plan. And so thank you for your work on that. Maybe kind of plan we moved forward. And Commissioner Hull, you had a question for the good of the group. What was that?
The dates of our next meeting.
The dates, I thought there was one more. So we are looking at for our next meeting dates will be in July 17th, moving into August the 7th and the 21st, and those will be our last Monday nights, and we should be able to transition back to Wednesdays after that. So thank you for your attention tonight. Dry subject, but I think it's very important. And, lot of great comments.
Thank you. And with that, we're at item number 8. Is there a movement to adjourn?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So moved.